Hey, you all. If you're just joining us, welcome to week 8 of 10 questions and what is community? Speaking of community, I'm so happy to see so many of you here so often. Thank you for coming. And if you're just joining us, thank you for coming. And if you're students in this class, thank goodness you're here. I just want to start with a few acknowledgments. I think it's appropriate that we're talking about community this evening because it takes a community. So you who have been here week after week, you know who we want to acknowledge. So could you help me by just shouting out, who are we acknowledging and thanking for 10 questions? Arsenio, Anne-Marie. I couldn't hear you, say it louder. The Centennial Committee. Andres Cuervo. He's right there. Who else? Vic Marks, yep. And also the Department of World Arts and Culture's Dance and the School of the Arts and Architecture, Dean Brett Steele. All right. Why are we asking this question? Why of the 10 questions is what is community? One of them. And I was thinking that the late, great Maya Angelou said, nobody, but nobody can go it alone. So particularly in a university, we often celebrate the accomplishments of individuals. And we support this myth of the rugged character who sustains themselves and makes discoveries and explores and all those things without acknowledging that they probably are situated within a community that has become less visible to support those individual accomplishments. And we're constantly in this place of failing to recognize the community that supports the individual. For students, as Kevin said earlier, we're each members of numerous communities. And some are temporary communities that exist only for a very short period of time, like, I need some help. What would be a temporary community? It's really good that you're speaking, except I have no idea what you said. The class that we were in today was a temporary community. Other ideas, just shout really loudly. A team, like a sports team? A sports team. It could be years, but at least for that period of time. And one more, a temporary community. This room? This room. And somebody over here? College. Yeah. And other communities are lifelong. Some we choose consciously and others less consciously. Some are communities forged by circumstance, and sometimes our community affiliation is not something we choose at all, but rather is something defined by others. You students have tremendous pressure on you to be outstanding, to distinguish yourself from the crowd, to be original, to fly solo, just like our mythic heroes. But the challenge is to find how it is that you can be your best self and continue to discover that self within the context of contributing to and participating in community. So that I-we combo is so important to navigate, and it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one at all. As an art maker, and many of you here are art makers, I find that the moments where you collaborate and create something much bigger than the sum of one person's ideas, something that exists larger than, is one of those opportunities to fully presence oneself and at the same time to be the deepest listener you can be, to be someone who says yes and. And then, of course, I know all of you have multiple circumstances beyond art making where that I-we combo is such an important navigation. And of course, art making or any other project is also a metaphor and an activity within life making. And in life making, we're constantly looking for that balance between I and we. Right? Right. I just want to share Maya Angelou's full poem with you as the last part of my introduction here, because I think it's so appropriate for this evening. So it's called Alone. Lying, thinking last night how to find my soul a home where water is not thirsty and bread loaf is not stone, I came up with one thing, and I don't believe I'm wrong, that nobody, but nobody, can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone, nobody, but nobody can make it here alone. There are some millionaires with money they can't use. Their wives run around like banshees. Their children sing the blues. They've got expensive doctors to cure their hearts of stone. But nobody, no, nobody can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone, nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone. Now, if you listen closely, I'll tell you what I know. Storm clouds are gathering, the wind is gonna blow, the race of man is suffering, and I can hear the moan, 'cause nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone. Alone, all alone, nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone. It's Maya Angelou. I would love for you to join me in welcoming our special guests for the evening. If you all will come out, I will very proudly introduce you and we'll get started. So this is Jennifer Ferro, Ananya Roy, and Kevin Kane. So if you don't mind, Jennifer is the CEO of KCRW, a UCLA alum, and has worked to transform the institution of KCRW from Southern California's flagship public radio station to a worldwide community that connects through the discovery of music, news, and culture, both in person, online, and on the air. In addition to fostering a vibrant social networking community and creating 100 hours of original programming a week, KCRW produces 80 live events, reaching more than 250,000 people each year. Welcome, Jennifer. Ananya Roy is professor of urban planning, social welfare, and geography, and the inaugural director of the Institute on Inequality and Democracy at UCLA Luskin. She holds the Meyer and Renee Luskin Chair in Inequality and Democracy. Ananya's research has a determined focus on poverty and inequality, both in LA and in other cities around the world. Her most recent book is Encountering Poverty, Thinking and Acting in an Unequal World. Welcome, Ananya. And Kevin Kane right here is the director of the UCLA Visual and Performing Arts Education Program, or VAPA, as we fondly call it, in the School of the Arts and Architecture. He oversees the program's arts education coursework, designs community arts and arts enrichment programming, and supervises public and special events. Originally from the working class suburbs of Philadelphia, and the first in his family to attend college, and pursue the arts professionally and get a PhD. Kevin has dedicated, and an MFA, Kevin has dedicated himself to using the arts and education as a tool for individual and social transformation. Welcome, Kevin. So we're going to move right into our first part of our evening, and Jennifer has graciously agreed to start us off. So we're going to take our seats.
Okay, I decided to go first so you would have low expectations and then it would just go on up from there. So my name is Jennifer Ferro. As you know, I went to UCLA, Go Bruins, so happy to be a part of this community. So I run KCRW, and I use the word community all the time. I talk about KCRW as building community, that the thing when I think about my job and what I do and what's the thing that makes me most proud, it's building community. And then I realized everybody uses that word and that phrase, and I was like, what the heck does that mean? And of course, today was a good time to ask that question because we're asking the question, what is community? So one of the things that KCRW does that I think is really powerful is allow people to be a part of a community while they're completely by themselves. And so you can be in your shower, in your car. In Los Angeles, we spend most of our time getting from one place to another. When we do that, we're often alone. And KCRW has the ability to be with you at that time. And I keep pushing that idea. When I was thinking about this talk, I was like, well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. Like, I just listen to something. But there is something more profound that I think happens. And we'll get to that, I think, as I roll through these highly complicated slides. So how do we get into community? That was touched on already. I found this quote. I thought that was really interesting. It used to be that people were born as part of a community and had to find their place as an individual. And now people are born as individuals and have to find their place, find their communities. So there's my graphic design for you. You could be born into one, right? And we have that. You're African American, you're a woman, you're or a girl or whatever. You know, you can pick those kind of things that you just are inherently, you have and you will automatically be in. And then, but the thing that's really, I think, very special is this notion of choosing your community. And when I think about UCLA, when I talk to undergrads, one thing I always think back to is the time when I was an undergrad at UCLA. So I feel like I didn't belong at UCLA. I know a lot of people have that feeling. I got an SAT score that was below 1,000. Everybody around me was so much smarter, and I'm like, oh my God, I snuck in. Someone's gonna figure out that I don't belong here, and I'm gonna get kicked out. And then I felt very alone, and I eventually found my community of people who shared my values. And I think that's, so all of this ultimately goes back to KCRW, but we'll run to the next slide, which is why is that? It's this notion about shared values. And those values you can have from your childhood, or you can develop them as you educate yourself and live your life and learn things. And the thing that I feel like KCRW does is bring people together who share values, and not necessarily political values. When we do research about public radio listening, we find there are people who are curious. They want to know things about the world. They want to know what's happening in places that aren't just right around them. They care about music and culture. That's what KCRW provides. People who have those values, who want to know about those things, come to KCRW and connect by themselves with people who talk to them on the radio or through streaming or podcasts, and that's where the relationships come in. And so this is a kind of a profound change. And again, all of this thinking was because I knew I was going to be coming here tonight. There's this notion that I've discovered from a lot of people who first, say, arrive in Los Angeles, and they don't know anyone, and they feel like they're just in a land of Hollywood or people who are not connected to each other, but then they listen to KCRW and they're like, oh, I found my people. I have a relationship with the people who are talking to me. So in the radio environment, I'm just going to use radio to mean audio that's in a linear form, so you can access it any which way. But in the radio environment, we tend to do things like have the same person on every day at the same time. So at 12 o'clock, in your behavior, if you're in a place where you're going to listen to something, you can listen to KCRW and you can hear Madeline Brand, and you can get close to her, because after a while you start to not only connect with her through her voice, but you start to hear the things she likes and doesn't like. Same with our music programming, which I think is also really profound. We have a DJ, let's say, who does our morning music show, Morning Becomes Eclectic, from 9 to noon. You can not only start to get to know this person's voice, but you can understand their musical taste. You can say, oh my gosh, they put that song on because there were, this particular thing was happening out in the world, and start to follow this pattern. But somehow through that, you're making this connection and you're building a relationship, but it's virtual and it's one way, yet it's still really powerful. So that's why I think that KCRW builds community. And so when I was thinking also about, again, that word, which is quite overused in the nonprofit space, I was kind of thinking like the hierarchy of community. So again, I'm not as educated as the rest of the panelists up here, but indulge me. These are the levels of community that I think exist. So, and I'm going to, of course, relate them to KCRW. So the first one in the yellow, quietly identifying yourself with a group. So you can say, yeah, I feel like I belong to this. So whether it's proximity, you know, whether you live next to someone, you're from the same hometown, whether they share your goals, share your attitudes, share your values, you can know like, oh yeah, I know I'm down with you. That's my community. The next level, I think, is publicly identifying and letting other people that you belong to that particular community. So in the KCRW world, it would be like having a KCRW bumper sticker. I have some too, if you guys want any. They're in my purse, don't let me forget. You could wear a t-shirt. You could, you know, portray your love for KCRW on social media. But this is the part that I think that I'm after personally, the part that I think has the most value, which is the third level, or the uber level of community, which is when you do something for someone else. And so I guess it goes back to the notion of myself versus we, or one versus many. What can you do for other people? And when you feel like you belong to a community and you do things on behalf of that community, I feel like that's the final level. And I think, I'll just tell you this aside, this may or may not be interesting to you, but when we look at when you look at voting, or you look at giving to public radio, depending on what kind of messaging you use, the notion that like you need to do this to support the free flow of information, you know, news and information is the bedrock of democracy, that kind of appeal, it really matters the most to people 50 and above. It's younger people are just like, yeah, you're not talking to me. I'm not interested. We have to use different messages for people under 50. But I think it's kind of interesting, and I think it points to this notion, just like voting, right? Voting is kind of a little bit of a selfless act. I mean, you know that your one vote isn't going to necessarily change everything, but you do it because you're responsible. You serve on jury duty because you're responsible for your community. And I think we tend to find that notion when we get older. I think that we can do it when we're younger myself, but anyway, that's my hierarchy of community. And then, of course, that got me thinking, again, I'm just gonna ask you guys questions, which we'll talk about later, but this question, can community be bad? And I think the thing that is something to consider about community is this notion of belonging. So if I belong and you don't, does that mean that you could ultimately become less human to me? And we do see that all over the place. We're experiencing it and living it every single day. So if you identify with a particular group and you happen to, you know, get involved in social media, whether it's Nextdoor, otherwise known as racist Facebook, or Twitter, you can see this happening all the time. To me, that's the bad notion. I don't know if that's a function of community, but I do believe it's a powerful thing, this notion of I'm in, you're not in, I'm out, you're in, etc. And I think that's one thing that at KCRW and public radio we really try to guard against. We try to be open and accessible to literally everyone. We're free. We talk about, we've talked to lots of people who are like, oh, you guys should charge for your content. We're never going to do that because we are a public service, a community service. So anyway, that's the kind of conclusion. I don't really have any conclusion, just a question. I shouldn't leave you with that slide. We'll just go back to the one that I designed myself, which is that one. No. Anyway, so thank you very much, and I can't wait to continue to talk about these questions that you guys have brought up. Thank you.
Hands off. Thank you. I'm not disappearing. I'm just getting a prop. Good evening, everyone. So I'm Ananya Roy, and I'm thrilled to be here this evening. So as you can tell from my title slide, I am going to argue this evening that community is made and lived through political struggle. As Vic noted, I am a scholar of poverty and inequality, and my research is concerned with and seeks to be accountable to communities in struggle. About 2 decades ago, my PhD dissertation, completed at the University of California, Berkeley, which was also the basis of my first book, was set in the city of Kolkata, India, where I grew up and where I remain rooted. While my world growing up in Kolkata had been a middle-class one, my research focused on informal settlements, often known around the world as slums, and on informal work, precarious livelihoods such as street vending and domestic work. For a year and more, I traced how slum dwellers struggled to find shelter in the liminal spaces of the city, along railway tracks and polluted canals. And in particular, I followed tireless women as they packed the local trains on a daily commute against hunger from village to city. These women worked as maids for the city's middle classes, who had come to call them the automatic washing machines of the city. And it was on those crowded trains that I, feminist scholar, came to understand how community is made and lived through political struggle. It is on those crowded trains that I learned what politics is. So it is on these trains that women, some of the poorest women I will ever know, engaged in political action with a creativity and fierceness that is unmatched. So every day, thousands of poor women travel ticketless on the trains to and from Kolkata and are militant in their refusal to buy tickets. They crowd, as you see in this image, into the men not allowed compartments that had been designed for bourgeois women. And in these compartments, they defy railway administration staff and ticket checkers. Fighting a daily battle against acute impoverishment, they insist on an entitlement to ticketless travel as a way of feeding their children and nourishing their families. And in doing so, they create community. It is important to note that these are women from numerous different villages who do not know each other. They are strangers on the train who come together in the space of these overflowing commuter trains to disrupt the status quo. In my first book, Calcutta Requiem, I argued that these poor women form a collectivity. While strangers from strange villages, they are intimately familiar with the conditions of each other's impoverishment. The conditions of their lives are agonizingly similar, and it is from this strange familiarity that they forge political struggle and the sense of community. And it is in community that they critique capitalism and patriarchy. They do so in unison, but without any formal coordination. These women remind me of a key idea in the writings of abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who argues that freedom is a place. Gilmore is particularly interested in what she calls forgotten places, or sites of what she has described as organized abandonment, and how from these forgotten places emerge struggles for self-determination, for human dignity, for freedom. This, to me, is the making of community. I'm an urbanist. I think about space and place. And this relationship between community, freedom, and place matters a great deal to me. Needless to say, while freedom is a place, not all places are terrains of freedom and community. A few years ago, I authored a book called Worlding Cities, which is about global capitalism and urban transformations. The cover of the book is this photograph by Salgado of a worker contained and isolated in the scaffolding of construction overlooking the skyline of a city that he builds, but from which he is excluded. And it is in the face of such containment and isolation and exclusion that communities from Kolkata to Los Angeles persistently built power and collectivity. I took this photograph at an inspiring meeting organized by social movements in Santa Ana, where communities facing displacement have insisted that they will remain and thrive, that they will lead social science research and tell their own stories of housing precarity, that they will lead and make public policy. I see such communities made and forged in political struggle as making what humanities scholar Lauren Berlant would call the commons, or what in her writing is the infrastructure for troubling times. These are transformational infrastructures, what Harney and Merton in this extraordinary manifesto, The Undercommons, write about as forms of fugitive planning. So fugitive planning as infrastructures for troubling times. And indeed, this manifesto is an ethical guide for the Institute on Inequality and Democracy here at UCLA, for which I have the great privilege to serve as inaugural director. The Undercommons reminds us that the building of community requires a dismantling of systems of oppression in particular. The building of community requires a refusal to make peace with violence. So Harney and Merton in the Undercommons write, and I think of this often in relation to the work of the Institute, we cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once and only once we have torn shit down, can we inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and knowing. And so the idea of community I'm putting forward today is about connections and solidarities that create a new common sense. Be it tenant unions demanding the decommodification of housing, or debtor unions insisting on the cancellation of all student debt, or the women on the trains of Kolkata insisting that if one is a citizen, one should not have to pay for what one cannot afford. That if one is a citizen, one should have the right to demand public goods. There are indeed many such examples of community in the long history of the United States, a history worth remembering in troubling times. For me, one of the most important is the rise of the Black Panther Party in the 1960s through struggle in a city that I called home for a very long time, Oakland, California. There, Black Panther leaders articulated a global vision of community, connecting ghetto and colony, recognizing the many fronts of war in a world system of racial capitalism and US imperialism. This, of course, was Huey Newton's framework of revolutionary intercommunalism, where Black subordination in Oakland was entangled with American counterinsurgency in Vietnam. But it was also about building an undercommons, about creating that infrastructure for troubling times, an infrastructure for self-determination, most famously through the Black Panthers' free breakfast program. At its peak in 1969 and 1970, the program fed thousands of children daily before they went to school across the country. And later, this would become a model for federally funded school breakfast programs across the United States. So with all of this in mind, my final argument about community this evening is about solidarity. And these two terms are often linked. Solidarity is a term that is used widely, and I would argue loosely, to connote community. That we are in solidarity with, in community with, those who are otherwise apart from us, those who are other, those who are distant, socially and spatially. I urge us to use the term community with great caution, and I urge us to use the term solidarity with even greater caution. Community does indeed entail solidarity, but let us then consider what it is and how it relates to community. There's a wonderful interview that Amy Goodman conducted a few years ago with Augusto Boal, the founder of the Theatre of the Oppressed, before he passed away. In it, Boal talks about traveling to the rural interior of Brazil to stage a play. Actors and peasants participated in the theatre, staging a rebellion against landlords with fake rifles. After the play was over, peasants came up to Boal and his fellow actors and said, "Why don't you now join us in taking up real rifles, in a real mobilization against the landlords who are oppressing us?" Boal notes that he realized in that moment that solidarity means taking the same risks as those that you want to be in solidarity with. If that is solidarity, then that is how community is made and forged in political struggle. It happens every day, but it's no easy feat. Thank you.
Hi. Wow. Just do it. Okay. Let's go for it. I was working with the students in this class in the previous session, and I already shared that this image behind me actually motivated me to sort of think about what I might speak about tonight. It was an image that I was immediately sort of familiar with and comfortable with. A group of folks. It turns out they're all men, but they could be numerous genders in that photo, but standing in a circle, holding hands, playful to me in terms of their body language and the way that they're shaped. And somehow with the students, we explored why a circle somehow can be helpful in symbolizing what we think of when we say community. There's no beginning, there's no end, everyone can be seen. There's an opportunity for everyone to lead and to follow. It's often a very useful metaphor and symbol when we work in the arts. With children, we often bring together children in a circle to sort of start the session, and that goes all the way through, I would say, working with elders and seniors as well. The community circle is important to many of us who work in the arts and outside of the arts. And I think, though, that it also leads me to sort of complicate this circle, because it's also a place where not everyone can get in. Once the hands are held, not everyone can join unless we open hands and let people join us. So it can also be a kind of wall unless we're really conscious and careful of that. And so already I started to think of what I've been working for 30 years since I moved to LA, and 25 years this year since I started being an educator, first through LA Unified and then later here at UCLA, to create inclusive spaces for the arts to happen. I've already complicated this beautiful picture that I liked into something that felt problematic already. So as I started thinking about what is community, I start from a place where it feels really comfortable and familiar to me, and then my mind goes into like a spiral of what do I mean when I say this word that seems so familiar? I can only guess that the previous weeks where we're asking very interesting questions like this is the same sort of process. The initial kind of question we're asking seems very straightforward and like, yeah, I know what that word means, I get it. And the more time we spend with it, I think we actually feel less confident that we know what it is. But I hope that at the end of it, we kind of put it back together. And maybe that's the way this process works. And maybe that's what a university is about as well, is taking apart things so that we can put them back together to really understand them. From my perspective as an artist, I'm always looking at it, and I always circle back to, and how can the arts speak to that? How can the arts be informed by that or impact that or make a difference in that conversation? I would share with you my own sort of thought process, which is very similar in some ways to Jennifer's process. So some of these words are even similar to what Ananya wrote. But I started with, what do I think about community, geography and boundaries? As 30 years here as an Angelino, one of the most frequent questions that get asked of me and I ask of others is, where do you live? How did you get here? Well, tonight I went south on Crenshaw. I hopped on the 10 West, transferred to the 405 North, got off at Sunset. You know, those are conversations that are like community conversations that happened, I would say, daily, where we're actually talking about, you know, what it is that we got here. And in the process of getting from my home in South LA to UCLA and Westwood, I'm actually traversing and crossing over so many communities and neighborhoods that are really important to me and the people who live there, but often maybe communities and neighborhoods that I don't really even know what they are. I'm just passing through them. But I try to think about where are the arts vibrant and alive in these communities? I looked this up, so I hope these numbers are correct, but I think they're probably in the right ballpark. The County of LA has 88 cities, 140 unincorporated areas, and more than 250 named communities. So even after 30 years, it would be really difficult for me to understand the full geography of LA. But somewhere after a couple decades, I sort of got the hang of it. I sort of started to feel like where things are at and where things are happening and where things are vibrant and where things are exciting to be at. And the arts was my way, a ticket into those communities. And being an educator was a way to feel like we were making an impact in some of those communities. And as on the flip side, really learning from communities that have figured out how to center the arts in their identity. These boundaries can start to fade away when we're using the arts as sort of a calling card, as well as a sort of a question, an invitation, a curiosity to sort of engage with different communities. I think about space. Where are people holding space so that community can actually be held and created, and where are the buildings, and also what's the space we're all holding for each other to make this happen. I think of things like time. How long has a community existed? What's the duration? The longer I'm part of a community, the more I can feel comfortable in that community, and that might be true for all of us. The less time I'm in a community, the more I'm still on a learning curve about what it is that that community has to offer. Every community has a history, and within that literally embedded in that word is every community has a story to tell. And my job as an Angelino is to sort of listen to all of those stories, or as many of them as I can. And hopefully my task as an artist is to sort of help first start with myself to help tell my own story in ways that could be important to others, but to really work with generations of younger people to know that their story matters, their neighborhood matters, their family matters, and the arts can be a tool and a mechanism for them to sort of share that story. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to take you through my thought bubble. So it's a visual representation of everything I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. And it's a lot to sort of grapple with, but it's also really important for the work that we do. And I'm just clicky right now, because there's so much about what's happening up there. And I'll speak to a few of them. The last one is joy and hope. I thought about, of all of the things that we're kind of thinking about when we're talking about a community and making art in communities, is there a possibility that the time we spend with others, the connections we're making with others through art making, our exploration of self-reflection, at the same time we're being self-reflexive, thinking not only about me, but how do I fit in with others, really looking at our commonalities as well as our differences, and really owning that both of them are equally important in the building of a community, but also in the making of an arts collective and an arts project. I'm thinking about how creativity, when it's at the center of an experience, can help build relationships, can help people feel like they belong somewhere. What scholar named Anthony Cohen said, the community is the great promise of belonging. And so how many communities do we enter where we actually feel like we are accepted for who we are, like where everyone knows our name, that kind of thing. I'm also thinking about spaces where there might be a reputation that it's a very challenging space to be for me. So it goes back to this idea of us and them. To what spaces do we not feel that we belong in, or we're not feeling like we're comfortable in, or we're not feeling like we're represented in? And how much of that is historically constructed and problematic, and how much of that is actually very intentional in a way that artists can be a part of either recognizing, those spaces that need to be sacred for some of us, and those spaces that are inclusive and open to new faces and new voices. And I think both are actually equally important. There's an idea of all of us being in multiple communities. We talked about that as students earlier, but we're also thinking about that as community members. We belong to many different communities, and different communities we have different roles, and some of our communities we're the elders of the community and we understand the history of it, and others we're just brand new to those communities. And I think there's a kind of both a curiosity and a humility that hopefully we can bring to all these communities. So that's a lot about what I've been thinking about, but I come back to bringing snazzy. Oh, thank you, Amarette and my team. I rely on the kindness of young people. But this is sincere. I always try to center the arts because the arts is the space where I first felt like I belonged somewhere. But it was even before belonging. It was the first place I felt safe outside my home. And it's an in-between space for some of us where it's not quite our home, but it's not quite school. It's the arts classroom where we were first felt physically, I mean literally physically safe to learn, to express, to share, to connect. And so I've been very committed to how that kind of space was instrumental in me feeling like I belonged at school. It was in an arts classroom. It's through theater, it's through music, it's through dance. Later now, as I've become the director of VAPA, it's through my students who are also creating spaces like that in various community centers and K through 12 sites, through photography, through film, through sculpture, through ceramics, through painting, through poetry writing. These spaces can be the one space in a child's day where they actually feel, A, they're going to be okay. There's a kind of healing that happens just from being in that space that can lead to a kind of burst of creativity and energy and connection. I made my best friends in some of those classrooms, and they remain friends to this day. So I often say to my students, you have no idea the folks sitting next to you right now, 30 years from now, could still be one of your friends. That's not a given. It takes a lot of work to sort of have lifelong friendships, but lifelong friendships are certainly possible in an arts space and in an arts classroom. And in that way, arts has always been about creating community more than about creating the next generation of Broadway singers or dancers or the next gallery stars or the next folks who are going to be superstars. I love those folks too, but I feel like my place has always been about creating spaces where community can happen. And I think that one of the ways I'm able to sort of commit to is offering arts in a way that change and transformation is possible, just like it was possible for me. Individual change creates an opportunity for a collective change and collective transformation. And there's one way we're looking at this. I won't go through all of this, but I'll try to sort of talk us through some way to measure what change and transformation in the arts looks like in our VAPA program. Is this, what do we call this, pinwheel? A slice of color that sort of shares a journey that could be possible in the arts, where it starts with social and personal comfort that can lead to social and creative confidence, that can ultimately lead to social connections that are really positive, what the author and musician Dar Williams in the previous slide called positive proximity, being really close to people who can add positivity to my life and to the life of others. And then that can lead to growing artistic knowledge, artistic skills. But if you look around this circle, it eventually leads to a way that leadership starts to happen in a space where all these activities and projects can lead to me really becoming a more confident visionary for not only what I want my life to be, but I want my community to be. And I've seen this happen time and time again, and I think that's something that as an arts educator I've really committed to. Could today be the day where a fire is lit in a child where they actually see their potential to be a leader, to be a visionary, to not only be an artist, but to be a change maker? a change maker in their own life, but in the life of others. And I'll sort of end with saying it's no given that every child has that opportunity. In our city, so much of that is dependent upon what neighborhood you live in. So I'm circling back to us driving through all these different neighborhoods. Can we ask ourselves, who are the children that live in these neighborhoods, and do they have daily access to high quality arts education? It would depend on what neighborhood you're in, whether you're saying yes or no, or sometimes or maybe. It depends on what school children go to. And so much of that is out of the control of the children themselves. So part of becoming an arts educator is also becoming an advocate for social justice and educational equity that includes arts as part of a child's education. It's actually a state mandate that every child needs to have access to arts. It's just very challenging, if not impossible yet, to sort of make that happen. But every day, arts educators and educators in all schools wake up and think about, how can I make a difference in that child? And somewhere in there, the end result of this sort of transformation is hopefully positive social and community change that could happen because a child or children or a class or a school had access to the arts in that way. In this way, I describe community engagement through the arts as a huge social project and not just about painting a beautiful picture or learning how to do a triple pirouette or actually making a film that everyone finds amazing. Though those are amazing, this is our ultimate goal, I think, at UCLA and in my career. And so when I look at this picture, circling back, it is a goal. It is not something that happens easily, but it's also something that's not impossible. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all three. What a special evening this is. We're going to make a transition, but before we do, I know that, especially for you students, it's a long day. You've had, I hope, some pizza, maybe more than one slice. And, here we are sitting in this room. So I'd like to ask us to we need to exercise the energy, not exorcise the energy of the room for a moment. I'd like to ask everyone here to stand. I'm not a big sports person, but I know there's something called a seventh inning stretch. But here tonight in this lovely theater and with Kevin's invocation of the arts, I'd like Mark, where are you going? I'd like you to cue the music. Mark, are you there? Okay, so we just gotta get the blood moving a little bit, so just like a little step to the side.
Inside my bones, it goes electric wavy when I turn it on.
And just turn to face somebody that you're next to.
Off from my home, we're flying up no ceiling when we in our zone. I got that sunshine in my pocket, got that good soul in my feet. I feel that hot blood in my body when it drops.
I see you up there.
I can't take my eyes off it, moving so phenomenally. Come on, like the way we rock it, so don't stop. And under the lights, when everything goes, nowhere to hide when I'm getting you close.
I was saying yesterday.
When we move, well, you already know. So just imagine, nothing I can see but you when you dance. Feel good creeping up on you, so just dance. Come on, all those things I shouldn't do, but you dance. There ain't nobody leaving soon, so keep dancing. I can't stop the feeling, so just dance. I can't stop the feeling, so just dance. Come on, ooh, it's something magical.
Thank you all. Take a deep breath. Got that blood moving a little bit. I'd like to invite our guests up onto the stage.
Does it matter where we sit? Anywhere?
So one of the things that we found over the weeks here together is that it's really nice when the students' questions really get to be shared here with you all. And so I'd like to just begin with some of the kind of questions that have been on our minds about community. And I want to invite you, we're try to keep our responses short, but not too short. Because they're serious questions, but there's a lot of them. Okay. Like a game show. Okay. Where does the desire to be a part of a community come from?
Doesn't it come from birth? I mean, when you're born, you're connected to this person. Kind of, I don't know. Again, I'm the one with the least amount of education up here, so just I can say the dumbest
You know
thing.
what? I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I think. Don't you think it comes from that we're kind of gestated inside of another being? I mean, if you ever have that great gift of carrying a child, you do understand that. This kind of parasitic thing is you're totally connected. It's not bad to have parasites sometimes. I don't know, but I mean, you're more close to someone than you'll ever be again in your life, I think.
Right.
Well, that reminds me, I'm not sure how I would answer it, but it reminds me of one of the scholars I was reading about community, who sort of talked about the levels of connection that we have, which starts with kinship and family. And so in a way that reminded me of that. Somehow it leads to spaces that then we go to school and we learn how to be socialized and we learn how to connect to others. And then we create friendships and bonds. And then somehow it leads to a larger sort of impact on society. So in some ways, community is that thing in the middle. It's a bit larger than our family, but it's more intimate and more immediate than society, which is a very large abstract idea anyway. So community feels like something tangible that I can be a part of, that is either a response to our family, depending on how our families were growing up. It could be an extension of family relationships that were healthy, or ways to sort of learn new kinds of relationships that were different than the ones that we learned from our families. But I think somewhere it's on the way to becoming socialized and a part of society. And there's, I think, an instinct to sort of want to be part of something bigger than ourselves.
Ananya, you really spoke about struggle as being a determining factor for building community, and our students wanted to think about what are the factors that create community. I wonder if we could. That's such a powerful way of thinking about communities that are born of shared oppression. But I wonder if we could just open that up to thinking about how are other communities formed? How does that happen? These are not easy questions, y'all. And not only that, each one of these folks comes here with a very particular relationship. I'm not reprimanding you, but with a very particular history, relationship, and depth of study about this question of community. They bring their expertise to us, but these questions, somehow they sit outside the margin of what we come with, and they're thought questions. So I really
Can I
appreciate
ask a question of Ananya about that question? So,
Yeah.
okay, so you were talking about the first book that you wrote about the women on the train. So do those women feel that they're a part of that community before they get on the train?
So it is in the space of the trains where not only do they get to see each other, but sometimes not even talk to each other because it's so loud and crowded, that they have what I call the strange familiarity. Like they recognize each other. There's a politics of recognition, but then there is a politics of collective action. So I think what to me is intriguing about community is precisely that not all social formations are community. Right? Society is not community necessarily, family is not necessarily community, but what then is community, and what then is community that one is not born into, but what then is community born of, right? Mm-hmm. And in particular the trains, but also one can think about last evening the Institute did an event in the heart of Skid Row here in Los Angeles, and one can think about Skid Row as an enduring community. So I'm very interested in the ways in which that spatial proximity and at times shared conditions of oppression create a community and create, in fact, also collective action. And radio plays a part in that in many parts of the world.
That's true.
I'm thinking about a mindset of looking at communities in terms of their assets and their wealth, even though many communities seem to lack the same financial resources as others, and this is particularly played out in schools. But regardless of what school you're at, I think you could find amazing joy and skill and expression and potential in all different sort of spaces, including those that are historically underserved and under-resourced. I'm thinking of a partner of the program, VAPA, that I direct, that's in the heart of Skid Row called Inner City Arts. And there's another organization there called Piece by Piece that works with the homeless population, creating mosaics and it's, broken plates put together. So even in neighborhoods that I feel like have a reputation as being oppressed historically, and that's not to say they haven't been historically oppressed, I just have learned to see that there's great beauty and a different kind of wealth that's happening in there that the arts can help give voice to and help express.
I feel like I could see a connection between the political, the actions, say, of these women who are forcibly demanding free transportation, and the arts in terms of that you use the means of communication and access to, I don't know if the word liberation is right, but access to your rights as a human being by getting on this train and saying, not saying, we're moving to the city and transporting ourselves for our work, and to make art in inner city arts. It's like we find our voice in this way. We express what needs to be expressed. There are no systems available otherwise.
Well, may I ask a question of Jennifer and Kevin, which builds on that, which has to do with is there a relationship then between community and what we might call the public sphere or public infrastructures or public goods? Because for me, the very passionate argument that you're making about arts education as an entitlement, and one that is unevenly distributed in a city like LA, or the argument about radio and what access to radio means, is an argument also about public goods and public infrastructures. And so do thriving communities require that, need that?
Well, I'll just, again, speak for arts education. I find that I'm drawn towards helping our students find ways into schools that are underserved in some ways and under-resourced in other ways, to find, to sort of balance out where there might be a disconnect and inequity in public systems, where certain schools in certain neighborhoods have seem like they have it all that they need. There's always something for our students to learn by being teaching artists in any space. But where I feel like we're learning most is when we're working in communities that creativity is vital to get through every single day. And the arts are part of the healing process, but also the part of empowerment that's happening whether we're there or not. And so in some ways, I think our city is failing a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of schools but children are going to those schools and teachers are teaching in those schools and finding ways to make it work. And we have a lot to learn from those communities, as well as we have a lot to contribute to those communities. So to be very honest, I seem to, I let the communities that seem to have a lot of financial resources take care of it on their own, and maybe direct some of our energy towards other communities where there's another kind of creativity that's like percolating every day in order to like make it work. I don't know if that answers your question at all. But that's my attention seems to go to neighborhoods that feel like are being failed by our larger systems.
And I'm imagining that part of what you're saying too is that public radio is part of what, I don't know if, I guess we don't see it as part of our political infrastructures, but that it is one of those public goods that enables us to grow and to potentially, I mean, share information and news that enables us to act.
Well, it's interesting, like thinking about that notion of access to information. So you can look at some countries that restrict their citizens' access to information. In this country, we have access to lots and lots and lots of information, but not necessarily easy access to real information or true information. And I think when I think about it through that lens, I think the notion of public media is really critical, because we're not, there's no political point of view that we're trying to push. There's no corporation we're trying to satisfy. There's nothing else besides just the public good that is the motivating factor for giving information. And I do think that's really important. But we're also at a time in media where the corporations that aren't even controlled by governments, they're almost their own government, are really controlling all of our access to information and privacy. So I think that'll be the next question that we have to wrestle with.
I'm just thinking, what is, is it a coincidence that public radio and the arts are, neither of them are economic, well, we try to argue that they're economic engines, but they are in a form of gift giving or a form of generosity back into community.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think they are economic generators. We make that argument all the time, and I do really believe that they are. I mean, I think even, like what our role in the arts community, in addition to talking about the arts and telling people about them, including one person who's sitting here in the front row, Anthony, who talks about theater for KCRW, we let people know about what's happening for people to go participate in. So, I don't know. I do see an economy there.
I knew I was in trouble.
Yeah. No, we don't just have our hand out all the time. We can support ourselves.
It's the large corporations that have their hand out all the time.
That have what?
That have their hand out all the time. They're the ones getting the subsidies.
That's true.
This is actually my question. Sorry, y'all. But as I was thinking about community, because I knew I didn't have any answers, I wanted to understand the difference between identity and community. And I wonder if you could help me understand that better.
I often ask what comes first. Do you belong to a community that then gives you identity, or do you have an identity that then gives you community? And maybe it's a mixture of both, or it depends.
I think I see it similarly. It would be hard to sort of choose one or the other, because I think with a recognition that all of us belong to many different communities, I think some of that is dictated out of our control, something similar to refer back to what you said in your opening, that some of our communities we inherit when we're born. Others are very random and we just sort of are plopped into. And others we really choose, we seek out. And I think, for instance, the ones we choose and seek out, a sports team Or the folks right now, I guarantee you, there are dance teams practicing in the parking lots underneath us, sitting right here, right now. They're choosing to be there. So somehow their identities are formulating in community with others who are interested in some of the same things. You know, these are affinity groups, but there are other kinds of communities we belong to where identity came first. We were constructed a certain way, and that plopped us into certain settings and certain environments where that happened. And I think, you know, we learn both those. You know, we learn both from both situations, I would imagine.
Could you give an example of the latter?
Well, okay. So I'll give you two. I grew up in an immigrant Irish Catholic family in Philadelphia, and I haven't practiced Catholicism in probably 3 decades, but there's still some very Catholic sort of like reactions I have to things that I feel like started beyond my control, right? Or before I was aware that they were happening. And very local things. I still sometimes call myself a Philly boy, but as I told the students earlier, I've lived in LA way longer than I've ever lived in Philadelphia. But there was something very like foundational about sort of where I come from, how I learned to be in a family, how I learned to be in a community that I both ran away from and also hold on to. And I think those things are very identity based, right? And I think in those days, and I think it's different now, growing up wanting to become an educated person, wanting to be an artist, growing up queer, that meant you left home in order to sort of realize or actualize those sort of ideas for your life. I don't think that's necessarily true for the younger folks I meet in my home city now, but those are the options at that point in time. And so I also think history plays a lot in sort of like where we're at in history to sort of know whether or not we can fully realize our identity where we're at, or do we need to go somewhere else and seek it out.
We had this incredibly plaintive question, how do I find out where I belong?
I think asking that question is a good start. But it also shows precisely this difference between identity and community. That if we think about identity as not only self-ascribed, but often prescribed, with categories that are socially constructed and that we often rail against, I think community as a form of belonging can be something different, something that we have not been told we must belong to, but that when not only do we choose to belong to, but that we often create by belonging. And that to me is very much a story around freedom often. And a freedom that is relational, it's not just individual. So asking that question is precisely the ways in which we create community.
So a good start out there.
Yeah. I think it also is, I mean, just to go super specific in terms of finding out actually if someone is really asking that question, how do I find out if I belong someplace? I think especially in times of transition, so whether you're moved from one city to another city whether you've graduated from high school and come to college, or your college life has changed and you're in a different, around a different group of people, I think you have to try them out, try out places to see where you belong. And I guess I'm also thinking about this notion of community and what's the difference between a group and a community? To me, a community is some place where you do some action that acknowledges that that something's bigger than yourself. That you can just belong to a group, but to really identify with a community or be a part of a community requires some kind of action. And I don't think it has to be huge, but I think it's a deliberate step that you take that says, this is important, and it's bigger than myself.
That goes back to the question of what are the determining factors when it comes to defining a community, and that's a really nice additional way of thinking about it, in addition to what Ananya presented earlier.
In some ways, I think we've been talking about community as a sort of practice, it is not simply a fixed, bounded thing. Though, of course, I'm very struck by the ways in which communities can be exclusionary, as Jennifer pointed out, or the circle becomes a wall. But we've been thinking about community as a practice, and both Jennifer and Kevin talked about traversing Los Angeles and these various geographies and borders. When I arrived in LA 4 years ago and wanted to get to know more than the part of the city that I live in, I realized that one of the ways in which one builds community in LA is by showing up, by actually driving or taking public transportation, whatever it is, but being physically there, by showing up repeatedly, right, to build love and to build trust. And it is a particular practice. And of course, I'm an urbanist, so I'm interested in what that space making and space traversing means. But in other words, you can't just plop yourself into those spaces and say, here I am. It is meticulous, diligent practice.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I'm just thinking, you know, I go to dance concerts constantly and traverse the city. And I realized the other day that actually it's not really that I'm going for the performance. I'm going to see all the people who are going to the performance because they're my community. It's kind of like a party with a performance in it. Yeah. I want to, there's two big questions here that I think that are important to address before we move it across to you all. And it is thinking about the role of technology now in building our sense of community. Some of the questions was, how has technology changed the way we view community? And there's a particular point about social media and community building or so on. And you all might be as important people to answer that question as well as these folks up here, but I'd love to just ask you to give it your consideration, and then maybe we can turn it back to you all. Technology.
I
Social
think
media.
technology is a force for good and a force for evil all at the exact same time. So when I think about, of course we can immediately think of all the awful things that can come from the easy connections that we can make on social media, but then there's so many beautiful things that come from that, and ways that people who felt isolated and alone found their people. And they didn't have to physically be present because maybe that wasn't easy. I think about movements, I think about Black Lives Matter, I think about how that was able to emerge and be a factor, an important factor across the United States because of social media in a short period of time. I think about the New York Times' diagnosed column, that kind of notion where you put it out to the crowd as to people's ailments and then finding cures for people that are because other people read them. But that was all through social media, so I don't know, good and evil existing at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's impossible for us to talk about community or movements or collective action in the here and now without thinking about social media. So on the one hand, the social media giants, Facebook at the top of that list, are a great example of today's enclosures. They've enclosed the digital commons. So it's a real irony that we use these platforms to connect to one another, and yet they are, of course, the purveyors of techno-capitalism. And in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, we know the absolute devastation that techno-capitalism has wreaked on communities, real communities. And yet, on the other hand, social media spaces, and find myself often on Twitter, are spaces precisely of public debate and conversation, that the new public sphere. And the new public sphere, not just for those who've had the privilege of an elite college education. In many parts of the world in which I work, for example in India, but across the Middle East, for example, social media has been a powerful democratizing force. And so I agree that we've got to think about the ways in which social media brings certain enclosures and exclusions, really difficult ones, but also is a key space now of community making, for sure.
I'm quickly thinking about this in like many different ways, but I'm going to settle on from the point of view of arts education and teaching artists. And it can be very tricky to require our students that we're working with in local schools to put away their phone for an hour or so and really go through the steps of creative process, because it's talk about identity. A lot of our identity is associated with how we are presented and curating our lives on social media. And I think it's a great, it's a great experiment for young folks who have never not known a phone and never not known social media. And that's, I think, the population we're working with. To who are they apart from Instagram? And how can the arts help them sort of experience, I guess, the withdrawal symptoms, but also the freedom and liberation of not having to be judged or liked every second or every hour of the day, and to create something that is a work in progress rather than something that's fully curated and fully presented as a finished product. So I think it's a great opportunity. Ultimately, though, so many of us show our artwork on social media, right? So once we're happy with it, then we do post it. But I think it's, I think there's a lot of research, and I think I just know it anecdotally, but a lot of us, particularly young people, have a lot more trouble sort of concentrating and staying focused on one task, because there's an impulse to sort of reach for something, like something's missing. What is it? Oh, right, it's my phone. But at the same time, there's also an opportunity, and maybe I would be interested in what the students have to say too, which is how do we learn to make art with our phones? And how do we make art in response to social media? And how do we learn to sort of explore identity and the tension between those two? Because it's a reality that doesn't, it's not going away, right? But I think it could be a bit of a challenge, especially for working with middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Thank you all three for those responses. I feel like we're on a topic that we really need to hear from the audience about this. So I think we have microphones ready to roll, and we're going to just skip our discussion with ourselves for the moment. And I wonder if we could hear some thoughts about the impact of technology on community exclusion, inclusion, and so on, from you all. Are you up for that? Okay, good. All right, so who's got a mic?
Hello.
Okay.
I have the mic over here. My name's Mark Bielemeyer, and I just want to say I'm very stoked to hear everyone speak tonight. I've learned a lot from all different parts of the different work you do, and I had a question which Dr. Roy was talking about earlier about kind of, and don't let me put words in your mouth, what I kind of read that as like the responsibility to pay forward what we can get from our communities, what we gain from our communities. Like I think of UCLA as this is a place where a lot of people come from different places in the country, in the world. They come here for resources to better themselves, to better their communities. And so I'm curious, what do you think about the idea of a responsibility to pay these communities forward? What is the threshold? Like, for example, I was a transfer student. I transferred here. I really wanted to work here because I wanted to still give back to the community here at UCLA. And so I'm in a point where I'm making choices to maybe move, but I feel like there's always work in this community, especially LA, to pay forward what I learned here and give that back to the city as a whole before I even think about moving to a different city. I just want to hear what you had about that, what you thought about that.
Let's have Ananya respond to that question, and then I do want to go back. The question before us was talking about technology, and I'd like to stick with that subject. So let's have a quick answer for you, and then we'll go back to where we were.
So I do think that the idea of community is tied up with related concepts, as I noted in the brief presentation, of solidarity, accountability, responsibility. So I like to think about accountability more than responsibility, and in the work I do, but also in the work we do as the Institute on Inequality and Democracy, we think a lot about who do we want to be in community with. And the point I was making is that I can't necessarily say that we are in solidarity with communities on the front lines of struggle, with communities of the unhoused, communities facing housing precarity, because we're not taking the same risks as those communities, we're not facing the same vulnerabilities, but we can be accountable to them. So that's a little different from, but might not be completely unrelated to paying it forward. So I think that that question of accountability, which is really being accountable to, is crucial if we are to think about an ethical orientation to community. And I say this because in the university setting, as well as in the nonprofit world, as you noted, the term community and community engagement can be used loosely. And what we had this evening was a very different approach to community. So I think part of this is figuring out which community do you want to be accountable to? And in what ways do they call you out then? And what does that demand of you? Which goes back to this idea of community as a practice.
Thank you. So, wow, the stream could divide and go in multiple directions right now, but I do want to just take a moment to jump back. So I think we have students in the class who would like to talk to us about perception of technology and impact on community. And so if a student has a microphone, we'd love to hear from you. I can't see you very well. Maybe we could lower these lights a little bit or raise the audience lights.
I just wanted to answer your question on how can we make art with our phones. So we have a department here called Design Media Arts, and it's basically code-based art along with video art, a lot of different ways of art, but they're not only like processing P5, these are softwares, but they're softwares to create art, and they're not only for like creating communities in between kids to do it, but also like other communities. So there's like very many new ways of using, although I agree with you that children should be able to do without their phones for a little bit. These are like very new and different ways of like electronics processing P5. And in like UCLA with these communities, we are trying to create and be more inclusive with these types of arts because they're not as known as other types, I guess, yet.
My name is Paloma Vieira. I am a senior and a fine arts major, and while my phone, yes, can be very distracting to my creative practice, I do want to recognize that using social media as a platform for sharing my work also like opens the idea and practice of critique up to like a whole world outside of just my studios. So it's like a super helpful tool to like understand different perspectives about my own work.
Great. Right up there.
I have a question about the relationship in the sense of community. So,
Take the mic if you don't mind.
I can't shout.
Well, you are a good shouter, but
Yeah.
this will be...
Comes from me lecturing. I'm curious about the role of relationships in community. So we've talked a lot about communities where there isn't necessarily a relationship except a shared value, which is somewhat abstract. We've talked, this last question was about critiques coming from the vast community where you don't necessarily have a relationship or an understanding of what's coming, the perspective of the critique. So I just wanted to open up the question of the importance of relationship in the definition or creation of community.
I think that goes back to that notion of what's the difference between a group and a community. I think that can be one of the elements of that, you know, and it also talks to your notion, which I love, of who are you accountable to, rather than giving back. I love that notion, because accountability is a kind of everything. It is about showing up and about feeling responsible to doing what you've said you would do.
So for me, community is about relationality, which is not necessarily about relationships. So family is about relationships, for better or for worse, right? And community for me is not even about forms of belonging. It could be about forms of belonging, but say membership in a nation state, whether we call that citizenship or something else, is about a certain kind of belonging. But for me, community is a particular relationality. The reason why I wanted to start with those women on the trains is, as I said, they're often strangers. They act in unison without formal coordination. So there's a relationality precisely because they recognize shared conditions, but they're not in relationship with one another necessarily. So it's not that they exchange phone numbers and keep in touch. They don't. So that to me is very intriguing. And that often happens in movements as well.
Shall we open this up to the audience for a couple more minutes? I do want to take 60 seconds. I'd like you to, exercise your voice with the person next to you, and just identify a question that you would like to ask, or an observation, or just talk amongst yourselves and make community. Now, let's take a moment just for everybody in and of themselves to talk to each other. Go. All right, here we are. We're gonna rock into this with a lot of energy, and then finish and then go our separate ways. So we do want to hear from you. We want whatever you have to say to be short, so that we have an opportunity to continue on together. We have a microphone right here in the second row.
Yes, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. This is amazing. I feel like a related thought to the idea of whether or not there's a community around you, or whether or not you belong to something, is the nature of story, and the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories we tell to other people. So like, I'm able to form community with somebody because of something I heard on the radio, or something that I saw on social, or something that I experienced in a theater. And then that sense of like, when I'm working with students and they're like not sure if they belong here, the connected question is, well, I'm not sure what my own story is. So I'm curious for the panel, at this formative time in your life, and like as a younger person, how did you start to form a story about yourself that you could tell to other people that helped build community around you?
Oof. That is just so good.
We're going to answer that, right?
I'm answering this. I'm letting everyone answer this for themselves.
Oh, I thought you were going to respond
Yeah,
to
I
the
think he was asking us. I was waiting for you guys to start.
Well, two things came to mind really quickly. One is that when I think you asked me to put myself in the age group of the student predominantly, right? And I was studying theater, which is an interesting topic to study, where you're trying to figure out your own story, because the task at hand is to learn how to play another person. But of course, the techniques you're learning, hopefully in a drama school or in a theater program, is how to access truth and believability under imaginary circumstances, and you refer back to your own life and your own experiences to do that. And so I think that process was really helpful, but really painful to do inventory on personally my own life in order to accurately or, successfully portray someone else. But I think it was really helpful in building the kind of muscles to a resilience of which is to know my story of what I overcame and what I'm still overcoming and what I'm struggling with in the service of the play or the playwright was ultimately also in service to myself. And so it was, I think choosing the arts for me was as much about healing myself and learning how to tell my story in ways that felt truthful but like empowering and not was part of the training as well as part of, I guess, the result of that work. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you for raising that point about storytelling. I think it's absolutely crucial. And in the work that I do, particularly on urban poverty and inequality, be it in LA or elsewhere, I think this question of the erasure of collective memory as a way in which communities are torn apart and displaced is crucial. So if you think back to that slide I showed from Santa Ana, it's very much about owning the storytelling, about telling their own stories. And in particular, the Institute, we've been thinking a lot then about how we might use the resources of the university to support that storytelling work, be it the community archives at a place like the Southern California Library, or the storytelling that housing justice movements are doing and need to do more of, be it tenant unions or organizations working in Skid Row. So I think there's also a very complex relationship between the stories that we, as gatekeepers of academic knowledge, tell about communities and the storytelling and memory work that communities often do. And I'm very interested in the methodologies that might connect those, that allow us to journey together, but also, in fact, insist that academic knowledge production is then accountable to those forms of storytelling.
I'll just answer this on a personal level, because I do remember being at UCLA, as I said, with my terrible SAT scores, and which of course now I realize don't matter at all.
Yes, exactly.
Not at all. But I felt like I belonged once I started working at the student media at UCLA. So I was one of the editors. I became one of the editors of the feminist news magazine, which I think it's now called Femme. It was called Together before. Better name now, gotta say. But we were together, and there's this, I'm gonna divert a little bit, but there's this woman who does really interesting work in Santa Cruz at the History Museum, I believe, there. And she was, felt always very socially awkward, and she realized that babies and dogs were this great conduit to talking to other people. And then she started to say, how could I bring that into this museum? Because I don't really like to talk to other people, but I want to be around other people, but I don't want to just be, not talking to each other. And so she came up with this kind of concept of almost like parallel play, like, when you're building a puzzle together, or I guess making a play together, or doing something where you have a job, like you're at a, maybe you're at a place like assembling something for other people, like you can talk about stuff while you're doing something, so you get past the awkward of things of like, I don't know what to say, I don't know where to put my hands, I don't know where to look, I mean, I'm sorry I'm sounding so microscopic about this, but I do think that ultimately when we do things, when we're in service to something else, we can end up creating relationships with each other, because we're not just like saying, meet this person. Like, I never used dating apps. I didn't have to do that, thank God. But I'm just like, how weird. You're just supposed to go out on a date and it's like, are you marriage material? It's like, I don't know. Like, it seems so awkward. Whereas I would think if I was going to design a dating thing, I would make people like work at a food pantry. And like, you come and you're like on the assembly line and you try to work it out, and you can see like, oh, this person is totally disorganized, this person's selfish, this person's helping out. And then through that, you can start to make conversation, and then you're like, oh my gosh, you're actually really funny. And I don't know. Anyway, so that was a really silly answer to that very important question.
Great. Do we have another question? We have just a couple minutes left right there. Do you have a mic? Perfect.
Yeah, I do. Okay, I was wondering if you guys could discuss maybe what happens when like a community dissolves in like the face of an individual, if like ascribed identities like don't smoothly overlap, or if you exist in a binary or a presupposed binary. Yeah.
Did you understand the question?
Can you give us an example?
Yeah,
Tell us what's
like
on your mind.
I'm half Japanese and I'm half white, or like if you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community and maybe part of like a really intense church group, and like these communities like resist each other in really specific ways, but obviously don't have to.
Is the question, what do you do?
No, I think it's really important, but I think we only have 10 minutes left, right?
I'll just jump in hopefully just very quickly, because I did think about that in my sort of, which is that I feel on a personal level to feel like stable and calm about the world we live in, especially really truthfully this particular time, these last 3 years have felt very destabilizing, and there's a lot of folks that I just don't understand how they're thinking about a topic or how they're responding to something. And not to be coy, I'm talking about politics. But I think it's, maybe that's obvious, but maybe it's sort of a way of into that, which is that I guess I share community when you go back to my home state of Pennsylvania, which is one of those swing states. I'm so grateful that I don't have a family that has different political beliefs than I do, and as a Californian, I think it's obvious. I'm so glad I don't have to go back to a Trump household for me, but I know a lot of friends that do have to go back there, and so somehow negotiating that tension has been really upsetting, and I think this time we're living in right now maybe brings up a lot of that, where we have a sense of I use the word utopian sort of ideas about community, but there's also a lot of tension and disharmony in certain communities. And that's an enormous amount of work to sort of find, like, what are the places you could go to sort of figure that out. And a lot of us are just like, I'm not even going to try to figure that out.
I'm going to just jump in to say we're really almost like literally at the end of our time, but it seems to me that this is a super important question that you've asked, and thank you for it. And it relates to this question of how do we deal with this charged environment and navigate these tremendously opposing differences or challenges in terms of where we connect. So I wonder if maybe just give an opportunity for both of you to respond to that as we move out of this.
So two thoughts in response to that. One, for me, community is not about cohesion. Communities can be deeply conflictual spaces, right? Conflict, power, those things, hierarchy are real within communities, even as they might hold together. But I think that if we are to think about the present historical conjuncture, but also the long history in the United States, but also the country in which I grew up, India, I want to be clear that the idea of community has been used in very violent ways and has been weaponized repeatedly. So today, so I had a choice to make for the brief presentation I gave this evening. I could talk about movements, right, that are a form of community building, or I could have talked about the ways in which the United States, as a settler colonial, settler capitalist state, has deployed the idea of community. And what I was teaching about today in my Histories and Theories of Planning class at 9:30 this morning was about sort of a key aspect of the Trump administration, which is around the insistence on immigration enforcement at the scale of cities, right? And the fight against sanctuary jurisdictions, But that program at the federal level is called Secure Communities, which in fact turned all our communities into borders and immigration enforcement, that sets the conditions for detention and deportation, right? So in fact, this idea of communities and of secure and safe communities has been violently used many times. If I think to India, and I think about the entrenchment now of right-wing nationalism there, the idea of community and has been used also in deeply xenophobic, Islamophobic ways, such that in the name of community, we're seeing widespread lynchings of Muslims, right? So I think that we need to think precisely about how community can be invoked in violent ways, and has been all through the history of many of our nation states.
I would just say, again, on a personal level, one thing that I really believe in is trying to recognize the humanity of the people around us. And I think it takes a lot of effort to disassociate how we think people think and what that means about them. Because I've definitely been in situations where I've met people who have shown remarkable kindness, and then later I find out what awful people they are. I'm just kidding. They're not awful people, but I would normally, if I saw that the way that they think first, I would think they were awful people, yet they still had the capacity for expressing tremendous kindness. So I don't know, somewhere in there is a balance.
It's helpful.
So these are heavy notes to leave on, but also really give us an opportunity to think about the choices we have to make. And I wanted to just ask, did Boal pick up a rifle?
No, he didn't, that's the point. He realized at that moment that they weren't going to join peasants in armed insurrection, that solidarity was not possible.
Solidarity was not possible.
Yeah.
But for us, solidarity is possible in that, well, there's a few things, right? Like we're going to leave together and go our different ways. That's solid. And also, we're going to play some music and you're going to dance right out of here. Music, go.